October 14th, 1985. Laurel Ridge, West Virginia. It was the kind of Sunday morning where mist clung to the valley floor like a living thing, curling around fence posts and slipping through the cracks of barn doors. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. In the hollows of Appalachia, autumn came slow and stayed long, painting the ridges in rust and gold, muffling the world in a silence that felt almost sacred. The Bramwell family lived 3 miles outside town, at the end of a gravel road that wound through stands of oak and hickory. Their farmhouse was modest white clapboard siding, a sagging front porch, a chimney that leaked smoke on cold mornings. Behind the house stood a weathered barn, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that Elaine Bramwell tended with the kind of devotion reserved for things that kept a family fed through lean winters. Thomas Bramwell was a coal miner, 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that bore the permanent stain of underground work. He'd spent 20 years in the mines, descending into the earth 5 days a week, emerging each evening with coal dust in his hair and exhaustion in his eyes. He was a quiet man, the kind who spoke only when necessary, but his children knew the weight of his silence. It wasn't cold, it was careful. Elaine was softer in temperament, but no less resilient. At 38, she still wore her hair long, pinned back with clips she'd owned since high school. She worked part-time at the Laurel Ridge General Store, stocking shelves and running the register, chatting with neighbors about the weather, the harvest, the upcoming church potluck. She had a laugh that carried, bright and sudden, like a bird startled into flight. Their son Lucas was 11, thin and serious, with his father's quiet intensity. He spent his afternoons roaming the woods, collecting rocks and arrowheads, sketching maps of the hollow in a notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. He was the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke, who noticed things others missed, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the patterns in the bark of trees, the places where the forest felt different. Amy, the youngest, was 8. She was all energy and imagination, a girl who named the chickens and talked to the dog as if he could answer back. She wore her hair in braids that never stayed neat, her knees perpetually scuffed from climbing trees and chasing fireflies. She loved Sunday mornings because it meant pancakes and church, and seeing her friends in the fellowship hall afterward. Sunday, October 13th, 1985, had been unremarkable. The family attended morning service at Laurel Ridge Baptist Church, a small white building with a bell tower that hadn't rung in years. Reverend Paul Strickland delivered a sermon on faith and perseverance. Elaine sang hymns with her usual enthusiasm. Thomas stood quietly in the back pew, hands folded. Lucas doodled in the margins of a bulletin. Amy fidgeted and whispered to her friend, Sarah Holcomb, until Elaine gave her a look. After service, the family lingered for coffee and conversation. Elaine spoke with Martha Kinsey, the sheriff's wife, about a recipe for apple butter. Thomas shook hands with a few men from the mine, exchanged brief words about work and weather. Lucas wandered outside to look at the creek that ran behind the church. Amy chased a butterfly across the gravel parking lot. By noon, they were home. The afternoon passed, as Sundays always did, slow and unhurried. Thomas worked in the barn, repairing a section of fence. Elaine prepared supper. Lucas disappeared into the woods with his notebook. Amy played with Rusty, their border collie, throwing a stick over and over until the dog finally tired and flopped in the grass, panting. At dusk, the family gathered for dinner. Elaine had made pot roast, potatoes, green beans from the garden. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and black pepper. The television in the living room played the evening news, something about a factory strike in Pittsburgh, a weather forecast predicting rain by midweek. Thomas sat at the head of the table. Elaine served the plates. Lucas and Amy bickered quietly about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. It was an ordinary evening, and then it wasn't. Monday morning, October 14th, 1985. The first sign that something was wrong came from the church. Reverend Strickland arrived at 8 o'clock a meter. To prepare for a meeting with the deacons, he noticed that the Bramwell family hadn't shown up for the early prayer group. Usual, but not alarming. Elaine rarely missed, but perhaps one of the children was sick, or Thomas had an early shift at the mine. By mid-morning, Martha Kinsey stopped by the general store to pick up a few items. She was surprised to find that Elaine wasn't working her usual shift. The store owner, Gene Holloway, said Elaine hadn't called in. He'd tried phoning the Bramwell house twice, but no one answered. "She's never missed a day without calling," Gene said, frowning. Not in 5 years. Martha felt a flicker of unease. By noon, she'd mentioned it to her husband, Sheriff Harold Kinsey, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and a methodical mind. He'd been sheriff of Greenbrier County for 15 years, long enough to know that most missing persons cases in rural West Virginia ended with someone oversleeping, a car breaking down, or a miscommunication about plans. Still, something about the situation felt off. At 1:30 p.m., Sheriff Kinsey drove out to the Bramwell property. The gravel road was quiet, lined with trees that filtered the afternoon light into shifting patterns. As he approached the house, he noticed the absence of sound. No voices, no radio, no dog barking. The front porch was empty. The curtains were drawn. He parked and stepped out of his patrol car. Thomas, Elaine. His voice carried across the yard, swallowed by the stillness. No response. He walked up to the front door and knocked. The sound echoed inside the house, hollow and unreturned. "It's Sheriff Kinsey. Just checking in." Nothing. He tried the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, stepping into the dim interior. The air inside was cool and stale, as if the house had been closed up for days. The living room was tidy, couch cushions arranged, magazines stacked on the coffee table, a knitted blanket draped over the armrest. The television was on, tuned to a station that had gone off the air, its screen filled with static and white noise. Sheriff Kinsey moved through the house, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. In the kitchen, he stopped. The dining table was set for 4. Plates, forks, knives, napkins folded beside each setting. A serving dish sat in the center, covered with a glass lid. He lifted it. Pot roast, cold and congealed. Potatoes, green beans. The food had been sitting out for hours, maybe longer. It looked as if the family had been about to eat, and then simply walked away. He checked the rest of the house. Bedrooms were neat, beds made, clothes hung in closets. Lucas's notebook lay open on his desk, a half-finished sketch of the forest. Amy's doll sat on her pillow, glassy eyes staring at the ceiling. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows, no blood. Sheriff Kinsey stepped back outside, his unease deepening. He walked around the property, checking the barn, the chicken coop, the garden. The chickens were agitated, clucking and pacing, unfed. The barn door was ajar, tools hanging neatly on the wall. Thomas's truck was gone. Then he heard barking, faint, distant, coming from the direction of the road. He walked back down the driveway, following the sound. About a quarter mile from the house, near the old wooden bridge that crossed Birch Creek, he found Rusty. The border collie was pacing back and forth across the bridge, whining, his tail low. When he saw the sheriff, he barked once, sharp and urgent, then turned and stared down the road, as if waiting for someone to appear. Sheriff Kinsey crouched down, running a hand over the dog's head. "Where'd they go, boy?" Rusty whined, pressing his nose against the sheriff's hand, then looked back down the road again. The sheriff stood, scanning the area. The road stretched into the hollow, disappearing into the trees. There were no fresh tire tracks, no footprints in the soft dirt at the edge of the bridge, just the dog, waiting, and the silence. By evening, word had spread through Laurel Ridge. The Bramwell family was missing. Sheriff Kinsey organized a search party. Volunteers gathered at the church. Miners, farmers, shopkeepers, housewives. Reverend Strickland led a prayer. Martha Kinsey handed out flashlights and thermoses of coffee. The air was tense, filled with the kind of nervous energy that comes when something inexplicable happens in a place where everyone knows everyone. 30 people fanned out into the woods, calling the family's names, sweeping flashlight beams through the trees. They searched until after midnight, their voices growing hoarse, their lights bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. They found nothing. No trace of the Bramwells, no footprints, no torn clothing. No signs of an accident. It was as if the family had simply stepped out of their lives and vanished into the mist. Tuesday, October 15th, 1985. The search continued. Deputies from neighboring counties arrived to assist. Bloodhounds were brought in, given items from the house to catch the Centerlane sweater, Lucas's jacket, Amy's blanket. The dogs circled the property, noses to the ground, but the trails went nowhere. One hound led searchers half a mile into the woods before stopping abruptly, confused, as if the scent had simply ended. A state police helicopter flew over the ridge, scanning the forest canopy for any sign of movement or color clothing, a tent, anything. The pilot reported nothing unusual. By Wednesday, the search had expanded to cover a 5-mile radius. Volunteers combed through the old McCreary Tunnel. a defunct coal mine entrance that had been sealed off in the 1960s but was still accessible through a collapsed section of fencing. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the walls slick with moisture. Deputy Carl Jennings found a child's Schuhe small sneaker, white with pink laces, wedged between two rocks near the tunnel entrance. It matched the description of a pair Amy had been wearing on Sunday. But there was no sign of Amy herself. Deeper in the tunnel, another deputy found a Polaroid camera, waterlogged and rusted, its film compartment empty. It didn't belong to the Bramwells as far as anyone knew, but its presence was unsettling. The discoveries raised more questions than answers. By the end of the first week, the official investigation had shifted. Sheriff Kinsey contacted the FBI. Agents arrived from Charleston, setting up a command center in the Laurel Ridge Town Hall. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, church members. They reviewed Thomas's employment record, Elaine's bank transactions, Lucas's school attendance. They searched for signs of financial trouble, marital conflict, legal issues. They found nothing. Thomas Bramwell was well liked at the mine. Reliable, hardworking, no debts. Elaine was active in the community, friendly, involved in church activity. Lucas and Amy were good students, no behavioral problems. The family had no known enemies, no history of violence, no reason to disappear. But they had, and no one knew why. Theories began to circulate. Some believed the family had been abducted, taken by someone passing through, someone who knew the area, someone who wanted them gone. But there was no evidence, no witnesses, no ransom demands. Others whispered about an accidental car crash in a remote ravine, the truck hidden beneath brush and debris. But search teams had covered every logging road, every overgrown trail, every steep embankment. Thomas's truck was never found. A few locals, the older ones who remembered the stories, spoke in hushed tones about the ridge itself. "There's always been something strange about Laurel Ridge," said Earl Macklin, a 70-year-old farmer who'd lived in the hollow his entire life. "My granddaddy used to say, the ridge don't give back what it takes." He told a story about a miner who'd disappeared in 1947, found 3 weeks later, sitting on a stump at the edge of the woods, alive but unable to speak. He never said what had happened to him, just stared at the trees and shook his head. "And then there's the lights," Earl continued. "People been seeing them since before I was born. Little flickers moving through the trees at night, up on the ridge. Some say it's foxfire. Some say it's something else." The FBI dismissed the folklore as rural superstition, but the locals didn't. On Saturday, October 19th, 5 days after the disappearance, a truck driver named Ray Hollis came forward. He'd been passing through Laurel Ridge on the night of October 13th, hauling a load of lumber from Charleston to Roanoke. Around 10:30 p.m, he'd taken a shortcut through the hollow, a winding back road that cut through the ridge. As he drove, he noticed something unusual. There were lights, he told Sheriff Kinsey, up on the ridge, off to the left, maybe 4 or 5 of them, moving in a line. I thought maybe it was hunters with flashlights, but it didn't look right. The lights were too steady, too bright, and they were moving slow, like they were following something. He slowed his truck, watching for a moment, then decided to keep driving. "I didn't think much of it at the time," he said, "but now, with the family gone, I don't know. Maybe it means something." Sheriff Kinsey took the statement seriously. He organized another search of the ridge, focusing on the area where Ray Hollis had seen the lights. The search turned up nothing, but the story of the lights spread, and in the days that followed, more people came forward, claiming they'd seen strange things in the hollow over the years. Unexplained sounds, shadows that moved against the wind, the feeling of being watched when alone in the woods. The FBI interviewed each witness, filed each report, but found no concrete leads. The case was stalling. By the end of October, the search was officially scaled back. The family's home was locked and secured. Rusty, the border collie, was taken in by Martha Kinsey, who couldn't bear to see him waiting by the bridge anymore. The church held a prayer vigil, candles flickering in the darkness, as Reverend Strickland spoke about faith and hope and the mystery of God's plan. But hope was fading. The Bramwell family had been gone for 2 weeks. No bodies, no evidence, no answers. Just an empty house, a cold dinner table, and a dog that still waited by the bridge every evening, staring down the road into the hollow. In the months that followed, the case file grew thicker. Tips came in from across the state, sightings in Charleston, in Morgantown, in small towns along the Ohio border. None of them led anywhere. The FBI followed every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, but the trail had gone cold. By December, the investigation was officially suspended. The Bramwell family had vanished, and Laurel Ridge, West Virginia, became known for something it could never explain. A place where a family disappeared. A place where the mist never fully lifted. A place where, on certain October nights, people still claimed to see lights moving along the ridge. Slow, steady, almost rhythmic, as if searching for something lost. Winter came early to Laurel Ridge in 1985. By mid-November, the first snow had fallen, dusting the ridges in white, muffling the hollow in a silence deeper than usual. The search for the Bramwell family had been suspended, but not abandoned. Sheriff Harold Kinsey kept the case file on his desk, reviewing it every morning before starting his rounds, looking for something he might have missed, a detail overlooked, a connection not made, a witness not interviewed. But every time he opened the file, he found the same thing. Nothing. No evidence of foul play. No ransom demands. No bodies. No witnesses who'd seen anything concrete. Just a family that had vanished between Sunday dinner and Monday morning, leaving behind a house that looked like they'd stepped out for a moment and never returned. The FBI had moved on to other cases. The state police had closed their investigation. The media coverage had faded. By Christmas, the Bramwell disappearance was no longer front-page news. It had become a footnote, a mystery filed away in a cabinet at the county courthouse, gathering dust alongside decades of other unsolved cases. But in Laurel Ridge, the disappearance was still alive. It lived in the conversations at the general store, in the whispers after church service, in the way people avoided driving past the Bramwell house after dark. It lived in the questions children asked their parents, and in the answers that never quite satisfied. Where did they go, Mama? I don't know, sweetheart. Nobody does. Elaine Bramwell's sister, Grace Holloway, moved to Laurel Ridge in January 1986. She'd lived in Richmond, Virginia, for the past 12 years, working as a secretary at a law firm, living in a small apartment with her husband, Daniel. But after Elaine disappeared, Grace couldn't stay away. She needed to be close to where her sister had last been, needed to feel connected to the search, even if the search had officially ended. She rented a house on the edge of town, a modest 2-bedroom with a view of the ridge. Every morning, she woke and looked out the window at the tree line, hoping irrationally, desperately, that she'd see something. A figure emerging from the woods, a flash of color, anything she never did. Grace became a fixture at the sheriff's office. She brought fresh leads, clippings from newspapers in other states about similar disappearances, theories she'd read in true crime magazine. Sheriff Kinsey listened patiently, reviewing each piece of information, but nothing ever panned out. I know you're doing everything you can, Grace would say, her voice steady but strained. I just, ... I can't accept that they're gone. Not without knowing what happened. Sheriff Kinsey understood. He'd seen it before, the families of missing persons, caught in a limbo between grief and hope, unable to move forward because there was no closure, no body to bury, no confirmed ending to the story. We'll keep looking, he promised, as long as it takes. But even he knew that, as the months passed, the chances of finding the Bramwells alive grew slimmer, and the chances of finding them at all became almost impossible. Spring 1986, the Bramwell house remained locked and empty. Grace had tried to maintain it, stopping by once a week to check for signs of break-ins, to sweep the porch, to make sure the windows were intact. But each visit was harder than the last. The house had begun to feel less like a home and more like a tumor place, where time had stopped, where the echoes of a vanished family still lingered in the rooms. The dining table was still set, the plates and silverware arranged exactly as Sheriff Kinsey had found them. Grace couldn't bring herself to clear it away. It felt like erasing the last evidence of her sister's existence. In Amy's room, the doll still sat on the pillow, its painted smile unchanged, its eyes reflecting the dim light that filtered through the curtains. Lucas's notebook remained on his desk, open to the same page, the sketch of the forest incomplete, as if he'd been interrupted mid-stroke and would return any moment to finish it. Grace walked through the house slowly, running her fingers along the furniture, the walls, the door frames, as if touching the surfaces her sister had touched might somehow bring her closer. But all she felt was absent. The house was full of ghosts, but not the kind that haunted, the kind that were simply missing. By summer, the rumors had intensified. In small towns, stories have a way of growing, mutating, filling the void where facts should be. Laurel Ridge was no exception. Some people believed the Bramwells had been murdered, killed by someone they knew, buried in a shallow grave somewhere in the woods, their bodies hidden beneath leaves and moss and thyme. Others thought they'd run away, escaping some secret trouble no one knew about, debt danger. A life they wanted to leave behind. A few still clung to the idea that they were alive, living under new names in some distant town, starting over. But the most persistent rumor, the one that refused to die, was about the ridge itself. Earl Macklin, the old farmer who'd spoken about the strange lights, wasn't the only one who believed the hollow had a history. There were others, older residents, men and women who remembered stories passed down from their grandparents, tales of people who'd ventured too far into the woods and never returned. Back in the 20s, a logger went missing up on the North Ridge, said Helen Pritchard, a woman in her 80s who ran the town's only diner. They found his axe and his coat, but never him. Same thing happened to a hunter in the 40s. And then that miner in 47, she leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. My grandmother used to say the ridge was cursed, said there were places in the woods where the air felt wrong, where animals wouldn't go. She called them thin places, where the world wasn't quite solid. Helen didn't claim to believe it herself, but she didn't dismiss it either. All I know is, people go missing around here, more than they should, and they're never found. The FBI had investigated those old cases too, looking for patterns, connections, but there were none. The disappearances had happened decades apart, under different circumstances, with no common thread beyond geography. Still, the stories persisted. And in the evenings, when the mist rolled down from the ridge and the hollow grew dark, people locked their doors a little earlier, kept their children a little closer, and avoided the woods after sunset. Fall, 1986, 1 year since the disappearance. Grace organized a vigil at the church. Reverend Strickland led a prayer. Candles were lit, their flames flickering in the cool October air. About 50 people attended, neighbors, friends, co-workers, people who'd known the Bramwells, and people who'd only heard the story. Martha Kinsey stood beside Grace, holding her hand. Sheriff Kinsey stood at the back, hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. After the prayer, Grace spoke. My sister was the kindest person I've ever known, she said, her voice breaking. She loved her family. She loved this town. She wouldn't have left by choice. Something happened to them. Something terrible. And I won't stop looking until I know what it was. The crowd was silent. Grace's words hung in the air, heavy with grief and determination. But beneath the grief was something else. Anger, not at a person, but at the absence itself, the void where answers should have been. The silence that had swallowed her sister's family whole. The years passed. Grace continued to search. She hired private investigators, none of whom found anything the police hadn't already uncovered. She corresponded with other families of missing persons, comparing cases, looking for similarities. She appeared on local news programs, pleading for information, offering a reward for any credible lead. Nothing came of it. Sheriff Kinsey retired in 1990, handing the case over to his successor, a younger deputy named Robert Hayes. Hayes reviewed the file, conducted a few follow-up interviews, but the case had gone too cold. The trail had disappeared years ago. By 1992, Grace's marriage had fallen apart. Daniel had begged her to let it go, to move on, to stop tearing herself apart over something she couldn't change. But Grace couldn't. The search for her sister had become her life, consuming every waking moment, every thought, every ounce of energy. She moved back to Richmond, exhausted and hollow. But she never stopped checking in with the sheriff's office, never stopped hoping for a phone call, a letter, a piece of evidence that would finally explain what had happened. It never came. The Bramwell house fell into disrepair. The white clapboard siding turned grey. The porch sagged. The windows grew clouded with grime. Ivy crept up the walls, wrapping around the chimney, pulling the structure slowly back toward the earth. Teenagers from town would dare each other to approach it at night, to peek through the windows, to see if the rumors were truth, that the dining table was still set, that Amy's doll still sat on the bed, that the house was frozen in time. Most turned back before reaching the front porch. A few made it to the windows, and of those few, some swore they saw movement inside, a flicker of shadow, a shape passing through the kitchen, something that made them run back to their cars without looking back. The stories became legend. The Bramwell house became a place people avoided, and the ridge above it, shrouded in mist and silence, remained a mystery no one could solve. By the late 1990s, the case had been largely forgotten outside of Laurel Ridge, but in the town itself, the memory endured. Every October, when the leaves turned and the mist settled into the hollow, People would remember. They'd tell the story to newcomers, to children who hadn't been born when it happened, to visitors passing through. A family disappeared here, they'd say. Never found. No trace. Just ... gone. And every time the story was told, someone would add a detail. I heard they found a shoe in the old mine. I heard the dog waited by the bridge for weeks. I heard the father owed money to someone dangerous. I heard the mother was having an affair. I heard they saw lights on the ridge that night. The details shifted, mutated, became embellished with each retelling, but the core of the story remained the same. A family vanished, and no one knew why. Grace Holloway died in 2003, at the age of 64, from complications related to lung cancer. She never found out what happened to her sister. In her will, she left a sum of money to the Greenbrier County Sheriff's Office, earmarked specifically for the investigation of the Bramwell case. She requested that the case file remain open, that new leads be pursued, that her sister's disappearance never be forgotten. Sheriff Hayes honored the request. The file stayed open, but the leads had long since dried up. By 2005, 20 years after the disappearance, Laurel Ridge had changed. The mines had closed. Young people had moved away, seeking work in city. The town had shrunk, its population dwindling, its buildings aging. The general store where Elaine had worked had shut down. The church where the family had attended service was now held together by volunteers and prayer. The Bramwell house still stood, a decaying monument to a mystery no one had solved, and on certain nights, when the fog was thick and the air was still, people driving past the house claimed to see lights inside faint, flickering, moving from room to room. No one ever stopped to investigate, because in Laurel Ridge, some silences were better left undisturbed. September 2008, 23 years after the Bramwell family vanished. The old McCreary Tunnel had been sealed off for decades, its entrance boarded up with plywood and chain-link fencing, warning signs posted to keep trespassers out. The tunnel had once been part of a coal operation that ran from the 1920s through the early 1960s, a network of passages carved deep into the ridge, transporting ore from the mountain's belly to the processing plants below. When the mine shut down, the tunnels were abandoned too unstable, too dangerous, too costly to maintain. Most of the entrances had collapsed, naturally, over time, filled in with debris and overgrowth, but the McCreary Tunnel entrance remained partially accessible, a dark mouth in the hillside that locals avoided and teenagers occasionally dared each other to explore. It was a place of rumors, stories of cave-ins, of toxic air, of strange sounds echoing from deep within the mountain. Some said the tunnel connected to other abandoned mines, forming a labyrinth beneath the ridge that no one had fully mapped. Others claimed it was haunted by the men who'd died down there in accidents over the years, their spirits trapped in the darkness. No one went there unless they had to. But in September 2008, someone did. His name was Marcus Webb, a geologist from Charleston contracted by the state to conduct a survey of abandoned mine sites across Greenbrier County. The goal was to assess structural integrity, identify environmental hazards, and determine which sites needed to be permanently sealed to prevent accidents. Marcus was 34, methodical, and unafraid of dark places. He'd spent years exploring caves, mines, and underground formations, mapping geological features, collecting samples. To him, the McCreary Tunnel was just another job, a few hours of work, some measurements, a report filed with the state. He arrived at the site on a Wednesday morning, equipped with a hard hat, a flashlight, a handheld GPS, and a camera. The air was cool and damp, the sky overcast, the trees around the tunnel entrance thick with late summer foliage. He pulled back the rusted chain-link fencing and squeezed through the gap, stepping into the mouth of the tunnel. The temperature dropped immediately. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone and decay, a heavy mineral scent that clung to the back of his throat. The walls were slick with moisture, dark streaks of rust and mineral deposits staining the rock. The floor was uneven, littered with debris-rotted timbers, chunks of collapsed ceiling, old equipment left behind decades ago. Marcus clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. He moved slowly, carefully, testing each step before putting his weight down. The tunnel stretched ahead, disappearing into blackness. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady, rhythmic sound that echoed off the wall. He took measurements, photographs, notes. The structure was more stable than he'd expected, the main shaft reinforced with old wooden beams that had held up surprisingly well. But there were signs of erosion, cracks in the ceiling, sections where the rock had begun to shift. He marked them on his map, moving deeper, 50 feet in, 100, 200. The tunnel began to narrow, the ceiling lowering, the walls closing in. Marcus crouched, shining his light ahead. The passage split into two, branches, one continuing straight, the other veering off to the left, sloping downward. He chose the left branch. The slope was steep, the floor slippery. He descended slowly, one hand braced against the wall, his flashlight beam bobbing with each step. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small chamber roughly circular, maybe 15 feet across, the ceiling higher here, supported by a series of thick wooden pillars. Marcus swept his light around the space, cataloging details, and then he stopped. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden behind a collapsed beam, was something that didn't belong, a metal box. Marcus approached slowly, his pulse quickening. The box was old, rusted, about the size of a large toolbox. It sat on the ground, half buried in dirt and debris, as if it had been there for years. The lid was closed, held in place by a simple latch. He crouched beside it, setting his flashlight on the ground, angling the beam toward the box. For a moment, he hesitated. This was a mine. People had worked here, stored equipment here, left things behind when the operation shut down. The box could contain anything: tools, supplies, paperwork. Nothing unusual, but something about it felt wrong. The placement, the way it had been tucked into the corner, behind the beam, as if hidden deliberately. Marcus reached out and touched the latch. It was stiff, corroded, but it gave way with a sharp click. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a rotting canvas tarp, were items, personal items. Marcus's breath caught. He pulled back the tarp carefully, revealing the contents. A wallet, leather worn, the stitching frayed. He opened it, shining his light on the driver's license inside. Thomas Bramwell. The name hit him like a physical blow. Marcus stared at the license, his mind racing. He'd lived in West Virginia his entire life. He knew the story. Everyone in Greenbrier County knew the story. The Bramwell family disappeared in 1985, never found. His hands trembled as he set the wallet aside and continued examining the box. A wristwatch, silver, the band tarnished, the face cracked. A child's hair ribbon, pink, faded, tied in a small bow. A set of keys, a photograph. Marcus picked up the photograph carefully, holding it under the light. It showed the Bramwell family, Thomas, Elaine, Lucas, and Amy standing in front of their house, smiling. The photo was creased, water damaged, the edges curled, but the image was still clear. And on the back, written in blue ink, now faded and smudged, October 1985. We're still here. Single quotes. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. He looked around the chamber, suddenly aware of how alone he was, how deep underground, how silent the space had become. The words on the photograph didn't make sense. We're still here. What did that mean? Were they here, in this tunnel? Had they come here willingly? Had they been brought here? Marcus stood, backing away from the box, his flashlight beams sweeping the chamber. And that's when he noticed something else. On the far wall, scratched into the stone with something sharp, were words, faint, barely visible, but unmistakable. Help us, Marcus ran. He scrambled back up the slope, through the narrow passage, his flashlight bouncing wildly, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't stop until he reached the entrance, bursting out into the daylight, gasping for air. His hands were shaking. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. I need to report a discovery, he said, his voice unsteady. At the old McCreary Tunnel, I found, I found evidence. The Bramwell case, I think, they were here. Within an hour, the site was swarming with police. Sheriff Robert Hayes arrived first, followed by deputies, state police, and a forensic team from Charleston. Marcus led them into the tunnel, retracing his steps, his flashlight beam guiding the way. In the chamber, the forensic team carefully removed the metal box, photographed the scratched words on the wall, and began a systematic search of the surrounding area. They found more. In a crevice behind one of the wooden pillars, they discovered a child's shoe small, white with pink laces, matching the one that had been found near the tunnel entrance in 1985. Deeper in the tunnel, down another branching passage, they found remnants of a campsite: old blankets, empty food cans, a rusted lantern. The items were decades old, covered in dust and mold, but they were there. Someone had been living in the tunnel, or hiding. The forensic team collected everything, bagging and tagging each item, documenting the scene with meticulous care. Sheriff Hayes stood in the chamber, staring at the words scratched into the wall. "Help us." He'd been a young deputy when the Bramwells disappeared, assisting with the initial search. He remembered the family. He remembered the frustration of finding nothing, the slow realization that the case was going cold, the weight of unanswered questions, and now, 23 years later, they had something. Not bodies, not closure, but evidence. Proof that the Bramwells had been here, and that they had needed help. The discovery made national news. Cold case breakthrough. Evidence found in West Virginia. Disappearance Bramwell family mystery. New clues after 23 years. What really happened to the missing family? Reporters descended on Laurel Ridge, setting up cameras in front of the Bramwell house, interviewing locals, rehashing the story for a new generation. The town, which had been quietly fading into obscurity, was suddenly thrust back into the spotlight. Sheriff Hayes held a press conference. "We've recovered items belonging to the Bramwell family from the McCreary Tunnel," he said, standing at a podium outside the county courthouse. "We're currently conducting a full investigation of the site and the surrounding area. We believe this discovery may provide significant answers to what happened in October 1985. He paused, his expression grave. "But I want to be clear, we have not found any human remains. The investigation is ongoing." Questions erupted from the crowd of reporters. "Do you believe the family was held in the tunnel? Was this an abduction? Are there any suspects?" Sheriff Hayes held up a hand. "We're not prepared to make any conclusions at this time. We're following the evidence. That's all I can say." The forensic analysis took weeks. The items from the box were examined in detail. Thomas's wallet contained his driver's license, a few old receipts, a folded $20 bill. The wristwatch had stopped at 11:43, but whether that was AM or PM, and on what day, was impossible to determine. The hair ribbon was tested for DNA and matched Amy Bramwell's genetic profile, confirmed through samples provided by Grace Holloway years earlier, before her death. The photograph was the most haunting piece of evidence. The image itself was unremarkable, family portrait, the kind taken on any ordinary day. But the message on the back, October 1985, "We're still here," raised chilling questions. Who had written it? Why? And what did it mean? Handwriting analysis suggested the writing belonged to Elaine Bramwell, based on samples from old letters and documents. But the message itself was cryptic, offering no clear explanation. The blankets and food cans found deeper in the tunnel were analyzed for fingerprints. Several partial prints were recovered, including matches to Thomas and Elaine. The food cans were dated some from the mid-1980s, suggesting they had been in the tunnel around the time of the disappearance. But there were other prints, too, unidentified, belonging to someone who wasn't in any database. The investigation expanded. Detectives revisited the old case file, re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive, searching for connections they might have missed. They looked into the history of the McCreary Tunnel, reviewing records of who had worked there, who had access, who might have known about the hidden chamber. They discovered that the tunnel had a complicated history. In the 1960s, after the mine closed, the property had changed hands several times. For a period in the 1970s, it had been owned by a man named Jedediah Crandther, same hermit whose name had come up during the original investigation. A reclusive figure who'd lived in a cabin near the ridge, and whose property records had ended. Abruptly in the 1950s, Crane had been considered a person of interest back in 1985, but he'd been dead for decades by then, and there was no evidence linking him to the disappearance, until now. Detectives dug deeper into Crane's background. He'd been a miner himself, working in the McCreary operation in the 1940s. He'd been injured in an accident, suffered a mental breakdown, and retreated into isolation. His cabin had burned down in 1952, and he'd disappeared shortly after. No one knew where he'd gone, or if he'd ever really left. In the chamber where the box had been found, forensic teams continued their work. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, scanning the floor, the walls, looking for hidden spaces, buried objects, anything that might have been missed, and they found something beneath the dirt floor. About 3 feet down, the radar detected an anomaly, a void. The team carefully excavated the area, brushing away layers of soil and rock. What they uncovered stopped them cold. A wooden trapdoor, old, rotted, barely intact. Beneath it, a narrow shaft descending into darkness. Sheriff Hayes stood at the edge of the shaft, staring down into the blackness. "We need to go down there," he said quietly. The forensic team set up lights, lowered a camera into the shaft, and examined the footage. The shaft dropped about 15 feet, opening into another chamber, smaller, more cramped, the walls rough and unfinished. And in that chamber, scattered across the floor, were bones. The excavation took 2 days. The bones were carefully removed, catalogued, transported to the State Forensic Lab in Charleston. Anthropologists examined them, conducted DNA analysis, compared them to genetic profiles from the Bramwell family. The results came back in late October 2008, 23 years and 10 days after the Bramwells disappeared. The bones belonged to 4 individuals, 2 adults, 2 children. The DNA matched Thomas Bramwell, Elaine Bramwell, Lucas Bramwell, Amy Bramwell. The family had been found, but the discovery raised more questions than it answered. The forensic report was grim. The skeletal remains showed no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no evidence of violence. Cause of death could not be determined with certainty, but the pathologist's best assessment, based on the condition and arrangement of the remains, was exposure, dehydration, or suffocation. They had died in the chamber beneath the tunnel. Trapped. The timeline was impossible to pin down precisely, but analysis of the items found in the tunnel suggested the family had been alive for some period of time after their disappearance days, possibly weeks. The food cans, the blankets, the campsite all indicated they had been living in the tunnel, or being held there, before their deaths. But by whom and why? The scratched words on the wall help you were examined by forensic linguists and handwriting experts. The markings had been made with a small, sharp object, possibly a piece of metal or stone. The pressure and angle suggested they had been carved hastily, desperately, by someone with limited strength or time. The analysis could not definitively determine who had written them, but the height of the markings, approximately 4 feet from the ground, suggested a child, Lucas or Amy. One of them had tried to call for help, and no one had heard. The discovery shattered the town. For 23 years, the people of Laurel Ridge had lived with uncertainty, with rumors and theories, and the hope, however faint, that the Bramwells might still be alive somewhere. But now, that hope was gone. The family was dead. They had died alone, in the darkness, beneath the very ridge that had haunted the town for decades. Reverend Strickland held a memorial service at the church. The building was packed, standing room only, people spilling out into the parking lot. Candles were lit, hymns were sung, prayers were offered. Sheriff Hayes stood at the front, his voice breaking as he spoke. For 23 years, we searched. For 23 years, we hoped. And now ... Now we have answers. Not the answers we wanted, but answers. He paused, his gaze sweeping the congregation. The Bramwell family deserved better. They deserved to live. They deserved to be found sooner. And they deserved justice. His jaw tightened. We're going to find out what happened. We're going to find out who did this. I promise you that. But the investigation, even with the discovery, remained frustratingly incomplete. The unidentified fingerprints found in the tunnel were run through every database, local, state, federal. No matches. The history of the tunnel was exhaustively researched. Every person who had worked in the mine, every owner of the property, every individual with known access to the site was investigated. Nothing conclusive emerged. Jedediah Crane remained the most viable suspect, but he'd been dead for over 30 years. And even if he had been alive in 1985, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. The FBI reopened the case, assigning a team to review every piece of evidence, every interview, every detail. They brought in profilers, behaviorists, experts in abduction cases. Their conclusion was disturbing. The Bramwells had likely been taken by someone who knew the area well, someone familiar with the tunnel system, someone who had planned the abduction carefully. The family had been held in the tunnel, possibly against their will, possibly under threat, for an unknown period before their deaths. But the motive remained unclear. No ransom had been demanded. No personal vendetta was evident. The Bramwells had no known enemies, no conflicts that would explain such an act. It was a crime without a clear reason, a mystery within a mystery. The bones were laid to rest in December 2008, a private burial, attended by family and close friends. The graves were marked with simple headstones, side by side, overlooking the valley. Thomas Bramwell, 1943 to 1985. Elaine Bramwell, 1947 to 1985. Lucas Bramwell, 1974 to 1985. Amy Brown. 1977 to 1985. The town more and slowly, painfully, began to heal. But the questions remained. January 2009. 3 months after the Bramwell family's remains were found, the investigation had entered a new phase, meticulous, exhaustive, driven by the knowledge that somewhere in the accumulated evidence lay the answer to who had taken the family and why. Sheriff Robert Hayes had assembled a task force, state police detectives, FBI agents, forensic specialists, and a retired criminal profiler named Dr. Catherine Morell, who had worked on some of the Bureau's most complex abduction cases. They met weekly in a conference room at the county courthouse, the walls covered with maps, photographs, timelines, and lists of potential suspects. The case file had grown to over 800 pages, and yet, the central question remained unanswered. Who? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In late January, a woman named Patricia Crane contacted the sheriff's office. She was 76 years old, living in a nursing home in Charleston, and she'd seen the news coverage of the Bramwell discovery. Something about the reports had stirred a memory, something she'd kept buried for decades, something she'd never thought mattered, until now. She wanted to talk. Sheriff Hayes drove to Charleston the next day, accompanied by Detective Linda Marsh, a state police investigator assigned to the case. They met Patricia in a small sitting room at the nursing home, a quiet space with pale blue walls and a window overlooking a courtyard. Patricia was frail, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap, but her eyes were sharp, alert, carrying the weight of something she'd been holding onto for far too long. "I don't know if this will help," she began, her voice soft but steady. "But I need to tell someone. I should have told someone years ago." Sheriff Hayes leaned forward, his notepad open. "Take your time, Mrs. Crane. Whatever you remember could be important." Patricia nodded, gathering her thoughts. "My father was Jedediah Crane," she said. "You've probably heard the name." Sheriff Hayes and Detective Marsh exchanged a glance. "Yes, ma'am," Hayes said carefully. "We have." Patricia's gaze drifted toward the window. "He wasn't a bad man," she said quietly. "Not at first. He was a miner, worked the McCreary Tunnel back in the 40s. Hard-working, quiet. But something happened to him down there. An accident, a cave-in. He was trapped for 3 days before they got him out." She paused, her voice tightening. "When they found him, he was alive, but he wasn't the same. He'd changed. He said he'd seen things in the dark, heard voices. He became obsessed with the tunnels, said they were alive, said they spoke to him." Patricia looked back at the sheriff. "My mother tried to help him. We all did. But he grew worse, paranoid, convinced that people were trying to take the tunnels from him, that they didn't understand what was down there. He started spending more and more time underground, mapping passages, digging new chambers, hiding things." Single quotes. She took a breath. "In 1952, our cabin burned down. The fire marshal ruled it an accident, but I always wondered. My father disappeared right after. We never saw him again. Everyone assumed he'd died somewhere in the woods, or gone off to another state." She hesitated, her hands tightening in her lap. "But I don't think he left. I think he stayed. I think he went back to the tunnels." Sheriff Hayes wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the page. "Mrs. Crane, do you have any evidence that your father was alive after 1952? Patricia shook her head. "No, but I found something. Years later, in the 70s, I was going through some of my mother's old things after she passed, and I found a box of letters. Letters my father had written, but never sent. They were dated. Some of them were from the 50s, some from the 60s. She met the sheriff's eyes. They were rambling, disjointed. He wrote about the tunnels, about voices, about keeping people safe underground, about bringing them home. Sheriff Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you still have these letters?" Patricia nodded slowly. "I do. I kept them. I didn't know what else to do with them. I never showed them to anyone. I was ashamed. Afraid of what people would think." She looked down at her hands. "But after what happened to that family, after hearing they were found in the tunnels, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The letters were retrieved from Patricia's storage unit the following day. There were 37 of them, written on scraps of paper, old notebook pages, even the backs of receipts. The handwriting was erratic, slanting, sometimes illegible, but the content was chillingly clear. Sheriff Hayes and Detective Marsh read them in the task force room, laying them out in chronological order. March 1953. "The tunnels are safe, safer than the world above. People don't understand. They think the dark is dangerous, but it's the light that hurts. Down here, nothing can reach you. Nothing can take you. August 1956. I've been expanding the chambers. More room now. Enough for a family. When the time comes, they'll need shelter. The world above is breaking, but down here, we can wait. November 1961. I saw a man in town today. He looked afraid. I wanted to tell him he didn't have to be. I could show him the way, but he wouldn't understand. Not yet. June 1967. The voices are clearer now. They tell me to watch, to wait, to be ready. Someone will need me. Someone always does. September 1972. I brought supplies down today. Food, blankets, a lantern, just in case. The world keeps turning, but I stay still. I stay ready. The letters painted a picture of a man unraveling, retreating deeper into delusion, convinced that the tunnels were a refuge, a sanctuary, a place where people could be kept safe from an outside world he no longer trusted. But the most disturbing letter was dated October 1985. October 14th, 1985. They came to the ridge tonight, a family. I watched them from the trees. They were lost, confused. I could see the fear in their eyes. I knew what I had to do. I brought them home, down into the safety. They didn't understand at first. They were frightened. But in time, they will see. In time, they will be grateful. The dark protects. The dark provides, and I will keep them safe. Sheriff Hayes set the letter down, his hands shaking. He took them, he said quietly. Jedediah Crane. He was alive in 1985, and he took them. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Jedediah Crane, presumed dead since 1952, had been living in the tunnels for decades, surviving underground, alone, descending into madness. And in October 1985, when the Bramwell family had somehow ended up near the ridge, he had taken them. But how, and why, had they gone to the ridge in the first place? Detective Marsh pulled Thomas Bramwell's work records from the mine where he'd been employed. On October 13, 1985, Thomas had finished his shift at 3:00 p.m. His supervisor noted that Thomas had mentioned feeling unwell, complaining of a headache, and had left work slightly early. Could he have driven toward the ridge, perhaps to clear his head, to get some air? Investigators re-interviewed neighbors, asking if anyone remembered seeing the Bramwells' truck that evening. One neighbor, Dale Richmond, who lived a mile down the road, recalled something. "I was out checking my fence line around dusk," Dale said, his brow furrowed. "I saw a truck go by, heading up toward the ridge. Could have been theirs. I didn't think much of it at the time. Folks went up there sometimes to hunt or hike. It was a small detail, but it fit. The Bramwells had driven toward the ridge that evening, and they'd encountered Jedediah Crane. But one question remained. How had Crane taken an entire family? Dr. Morell, the criminal profiler, offered a theory during a task force meeting. Crane wasn't violent, she explained, tapping a pen against the table. None of the letters suggest aggression. He believed he was helping, protecting. He likely approached them as a good Samaritan, someone offering assistance. She gestured toward the timeline on the wall. Thomas's truck was never found. My theory is that the family had car trouble on the ridge. Crane approached them, offered help, and led them into the tunnels, possibly under the pretense of taking them to a phone or a safe place to wait for assistance. Sheriff Hayes frowned, but they would have resisted once they realized what was happening. Not necessarily, Dr. Morell said. Crane was an older man by then mid-60s, probably frail. He wouldn't have been physically threatening, but he knew the tunnels. He controlled the environment. Once they were inside, disoriented, possibly separated, it would have been difficult to escape. She paused, and based on the evidence, I believe Crane didn't intend to harm them. He intended to keep them, to protect them. But his mental state was so deteriorated that he couldn't care for them properly. They likely died from exposure, dehydration, or lack of food, not from violence, but from neglect. It was a grim conclusion, but it made sense. In February 2009, investigators returned to the McCreary Tunnel with a renewed focus. Using the letters as a guide, they explored deeper sections of the tunnel system, areas that hadn't been fully searched before. They brought in spelunkers, geologists, and forensic anthropologists, mapping the underground network in painstaking detail, and they found more. In a chamber nearly a quarter-mile from the main entrance, they discovered evidence of long-term habitation makeshift furniture, old clothes, canned goods dating back to the 1950s, stacks of newspapers, journals filled with Crane's writings. It was a dwelling, a home. Jedediah Crane had lived there for decades, but there was no sign of Crane himself, no remains, no body, just the remnants of a life spent underground, alone, in the dark. One of the journals found in the chamber was particularly revealing. The entries spanned from 1975 to 1986, written in the same erratic hand as the letters. The early entries were mundane lists of supplies, notes on tunnel maintenance, observations about wildlife and weather. But the later entries grew darker. April 1984. The world above is crumbling. I hear it in the wind. I see it in the faces of the people in town. They are lost. They need guidance. They need shelter. When the time comes, I will be ready. September 1985. I feel it coming. Something is drawing near. A purpose. A calling. The tunnels are ready. I am ready. And then, the entry from October 14th, 1985. They arrived tonight. A man, a woman, 2 children. They were frightened. I told them not to be. I told them I would keep them safe. But they did not listen. They tried to leave. I could not let them. The world above is not safe. They do not understand. I locked the passage. I will show them. In time, they will see. The entries after that became fragmented, desperate. October 20th, 1985. They are not eating. I bring them food, but they refuse. The woman cries. The children are quiet. I do not understand. I am helping them. Why do they not see? October 25th, 1985. The man tried to break the door. I had to reinforce it. I cannot let them leave. It is not safe. They must stay. They must understand. November 2nd, 1985. The woman is weak. She does not move much anymore. The children hold her. I brought water. I do not know what else to do. And then, the final entry, November 10th, 1985. They are silent now. I check on them, but they do not respond. I think they are sleeping. I will let them rest. The tunnels will keep them safe, even in sleep, even in silence. Sheriff Hayes closed the journal, his jaw tight. Jedediah Crane hadn't meant to kill the Bramwells, but he had, through isolation, through confinement, through a twisted belief that he was protecting them, and when they had died, he had left them there. The search for Crane's remains intensified. If he had lived in the tunnels until at least late 1985, what had happened to him after? The team explored every branching passage, every hidden chamber, every collapsed section. They used cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging. In March 2009, in a narrow crawl space at the deepest point of the tunnel system, they found him, Jedediah Crane, or what was left of him. His skeletal remains were curled in a fetal position, wedged into a crevice barely wide enough to fit a human body. He was clutching a rusted flashlight, long dead, its batteries corroded. Forensic analysis suggested he had died in late 1985 or early 1986, likely from starvation, dehydration, or hypothermia. It appeared he had crawled into the crevice and been unable to get out. Perhaps he had gone looking for something. Perhaps he had simply gotten lost. Or perhaps, in his fractured mind, he had believed he was going deeper, seeking some final refuge in the Earth's embrace. Whatever the reason, Jedediah Crane had died alone in the darkness, just as the Bramwells had. The final pieces of the puzzle came together in April 2009. Thomas Bramwell's truck was found by a hiker, half buried in a ravine 2 miles from the McCreary Tunnel entrance, hidden beneath years of overgrowth and debris. Inside, investigators found more evidence: Amy's backpack, a thermos, a road map with the ridge circled in pencil. The theory solidified. The family had driven to the ridge on the evening of October 13, 1985, perhaps for a scenic drive, perhaps to explore, perhaps because Thomas wanted to clear his head after a difficult day at work. They had encountered car trouble. Jedediah Crane, watching from the woods, had approached them, offered help, and led them into the tunnels. Once inside, disoriented and trapped, they had been unable to escape. Crane had locked them in, believing he was protecting them, and they had died there, slowly, desperately, calling for help that never came. In May 2009, the Greenbrier County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. Sheriff Hayes stood at the podium, flanked by Detective Marsh and Dr. Morell. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, microphones. "We have concluded our investigation into the disappearance and deaths of the Bramwell family," Hayes began, his voice steady but heavy. "After extensive forensic analysis and investigative work, we have determined that Thomas, Elaine, Lucas, and Amy Bramwell were taken into the McCreary Tunnel by Jedediah Crane, a man suffering from severe mental illness, who had been living in the tunnels since the early 1950s. He paused, letting the words settle. Crane believed he was protecting the family by keeping them underground. He confined them in a sealed chamber, where they died from exposure and lack of resource. Crane himself died shortly after, also in the tunnels. Hayes glanced down at his notes. This case has haunted our community for nearly 24 years. Today, we have answers. Not the answers we hoped for, but answers nonetheless. The Bramwell family can finally rest in peace, and we can honor their memory by ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again. A reporter raised a hand. "Sheriff, do you believe Crane acted alone?" "Yes," Hayes said firmly. "All evidence points to a single individual acting out of delusion, not malice." Another reporter spoke up. "What about the photograph found in the tunnel? The one with the message, 'We're still here'?" Hayes's expression softened. "We believe Elaine Bramwell wrote that message in the days after they were taken. It was a plea, a desperate attempt to leave behind proof of their existence, in the hope that someone would find it." His voice cracked slightly, and eventually, someone did. The story of the Bramwell family's disappearance became a cautionary tale, a tragedy dissected in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books. It was a case that defied simple explanation, a collision of mental illness, isolation, and circumstance that had ended in unimaginable loss. But, for the people of Laurel Ridge, it was more than a story. It was a wound that had finally begun to heal. The Bramwell house, which had stood empty and decaying for over 2 decades, was torn down in the summer of 2009. The land was cleared, returned to nature, allowed to become part of the forest once again. The McCreary Tunnel was permanently sealed, its entrance filled with concrete, marked with a memorial plaque, in memory of Thomas, Elaine, Lucas, and Amy Bramwell. Lost October 1985, found September 2008. May they rest in peace. Flowers were left at the site, regularly wildflowers, mostly picked from the ridge, and placed gently at the base of the plaque. Years later, people still spoke about the case, not with the same fear and speculation as before, but with a kind of somber understanding. "It's a reminder," Reverend Strickland said during a sermon in 2012, "that evil isn't always a monster. Sometimes it's a broken mind, a lost soul, someone who believed they were doing good even as they caused harm." He looked out at his congregation. "And it's a reminder that we must take care of each other, that we must reach out to those who are suffering, who are isolated, who are slipping into darkness, because if we don't, tragedies like this will happen again." In the end, the Bramwell case was closed, but the questions about how such a thing could happen, about what could have been done differently, about the fragile line between sanity and madness. And in Laurel Ridge, on foggy October evenings, when the mist settled into the hollow, people still paused as they passed the place where the Bramwell house once stood. They still remembered, and they still whispered, not about lights on the ridge anymore, but about a family that had been lost, and the man who thought he was saving them. 15 years later, October 2024, Laurel Ridge, West Virginia, had changed in the decades since the Bramwell family disappeared. The population had dwindled further. More mines had closed. Young people continued to leave, seeking opportunities in cities where the economy hadn't collapsed beneath the weight of a dying industry. The main street, once lined with shops and businesses, now held mostly empty storefronts, their windows dark, their signs faded. But the town endured. The church still stood, its white walls repainted every few years by volunteers. The diner still served breakfast to the handful of regulars who gathered there each morning, and the people who remained, the ones who'd chosen to stay, who'd weathered the decades of hardship and change, still carried the story of the Bramwells with them, not as a burden anymore, but as a memory, a lesson, a ghost that had finally been laid to rest. On October 14, 2024, 39 years to the day since the family vanished, small ceremony was held at the memorial plaque near the sealed entrance of the McCreary Tunnel. About 20 people attended. Most were elderly now, their faces lined with age, their steps slower than they'd once been. Sheriff Robert Hayes, long retired, stood beside the plaque, his hair white, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes still sharp. Reverend Strickland had passed away in 2018, but his successor, Reverend Amanda Cole, a woman in her 40s who'd moved to Laurel Ridge from Ohio, led the gathering in prayer. "We gather here today," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet clearing, "not to relive the tragedy, but to honor the memory of 4 lives taken too soon. Thomas, Elaine, Lucas, and Amy Bramwell were not just victims of circumstance. They were a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. They were neighbors, friends, members of a community that loved them." She paused, glancing at the faces gathered around her. Their story reminds us that evil does not always arrive with intent. Sometimes it wears the face of confusion, of illness, of a mind broken by trauma. And it reminds us that we must be vigilant, not just in protecting ourselves, but in reaching out to those who are lost, who are suffering in silence. She bowed her head. May they rest in peace. And may we never forget. The gathering stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant call of a crow. Then, one by one, people stepped forward and placed flowers at the base of the plaque. Wildflowers, mostly, picked from the ridge that morning. Among the attendees was a young woman named Claire Dawson. She was 28, a journalist from Charleston working on a documentary about cold cases in Appalachia. She'd spent the past year researching the Bramwell case, interviewing the people who'd been involved in the investigation, poring over case files and archived news reports. She'd come to Laurel Ridge to understand not just what had happened, but why the story still resonated so deeply, even decades later. After the ceremony, she approached Sheriff Hayes, who was standing alone near the tree line, staring up at the ridge. "Sheriff Hayes," she said gently. He turned, offering a faint smile. "Just Hayes now," he said. "Been retired for 10 years. I'm Claire Dawson," she said, extending a hand. "I'm working on a documentary about the Bramwell case. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." Hayes shook her hand, his grip still firm despite his age. "I've answered a lot of questions over the years," he said. "But sure, what do you want to know?" Claire pulled out a small recorder, clicking it on. "What do you think about when you come here?" she asked. Hayes was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the ridge. "I think about how close we were," he said finally. "In the early days of the investigation, we searched that tunnel. We went inside, looked around, didn't find anything. We were maybe 50 feet from where they were being held, and we didn't know it." His voice tightened. "If we'd searched deeper, if we'd pushed further, maybe we could have saved them." Claire nodded slowly. "You couldn't have known." "No," Hayes agreed. "But that doesn't make it easier." He turned to face her. "This case taught me something. It taught me that the world is full of tragedies that don't make sense. People disappear. Lives end. And sometimes, no matter how hard you search, no matter how many resources you throw at it, you don't find answers until it's too late." He paused. "But you keep searching anyway. Because that's what you owe the victims. That's what you owe their families." Claire studied his face, seeing the weight of decades etched into his features. "Do you think Jedediah Crane knew what he was doing?" she asked. "Do you think he understood that he was killing them?" Hayes considered the question. "I don't think he did," he said quietly. "I think, in his mind, he was protecting them. He'd spent so long underground, so long isolated from reality, that he'd lost the ability to see the world clearly. He wasn't evil, he was broken." He sighed. "But that doesn't absolve him. Intent doesn't erase harm. The Bramwells died because of his actions, and that's something he took to his grave." Later that afternoon, Claire visited the cemetery where the Bramwell family was buried. The graves were well maintained, the grass trimmed, the headstones clean. Fresh flowers had been placed on each, one roses, daisies, lilies. Claire stood there for a long time, reading the inscriptions, imagining the lives that had been cut short. Thomas, who'd worked in the mines for 20 years, who'd loved his family and his quiet life in the hollow. Elaine, who'd sung hymns with joy, who'd tended her garden and chatted with neighbors at the store. Lucas, who'd mapped the forest and collected arrowheads, who'd been on the cusp of adolescence, full of curiosity and potential. Amy, who'd chased butterflies and named the chickens, who'd been 8 years old and had her whole life ahead of her. Claire felt a tightness in her chest. These weren't just names in a case file. They were people, and they deserved to be remembered. That evening, Claire sat in her motel room, reviewing her notes, listening to the recordings she'd made throughout the day. She thought about the people she'd interviewed, the retired sheriff, the elderly neighbors, the woman who now ran the diner, and had been Amy's classmate in elementary school. They all carried pieces of the story. Some remembered the search, the fear, the confusion. Others remembered the discovery, the grief, the slow process of understanding. And all of them, in one way or another, spoke about how the case had changed them. "It made us realize how fragile everything is," one woman had said. "How quickly a normal day can turn into a nightmare. How important it is to pay attention, to look out for each other." Another man, a former deputy who'd assisted in the original search, had said something that stuck with Claire. "We learned that monsters aren't always what we expect. Sometimes they're just people who got lost. People who needed help and never got it. Claire's documentary premiered in early 2025, screened at a small film festival in Charleston, before being picked up by a streaming platform. It was titled The Silence of Laurel Ridge, The Bramwell Family Mystery. The documentary was thorough, respectful, and deeply human. It presented the facts of the case without sensationalism, honoring the victims while exploring the broader questions about mental illness, isolation, and the failures of systems meant to protect vulnerable individuals. It featured interviews with Sheriff Hayes, Detective Marsh, Dr. Morell, and several residents of Laurel Ridge. It included archival footage from the 1985 investigation, photographs of the family, and recreations of key moments in the timeline. But the most powerful segment came near the end, when Claire visited the memorial plaque and read aloud from one of the letters. Jedediah Crane had written not to justify his actions, but to illustrate the tragedy of a mind disconnected from reality. He believed he was doing good, Claire said, standing in front of the sealed tunnel entrance. And that's perhaps the most haunting part of this story, because it means that tragedy can come not just from malice, but from broken minds, from isolation, from the absence of help when it's needed most. She paused, the camera lingering on her face. The Bramwell family's story is not just about what happened to them. It's about what we owe each other as a society. It's about recognizing when someone is suffering. It's about reaching out before it's too late. The camera pulled back, showing the plaque, the flowers, the forest, beyond. Because in the end, Claire continued, the silence that took this family wasn't just the silence of the tunnels. It was the silence of a community that didn't see the warning signs. The silence of systems that failed a man who desperately needed help. And the silence of a tragedy that could have been prevented. The documentary was well received, praised for its sensitivity and depth. It sparked conversations about mental health, about the isolation faced by individuals in rural communities, about the importance of intervention and support systems, and it brought renewed attention to the Bramwell case not as a sensational mystery, but as a human story worth remembering. In Laurel Ridge, life continued. The town remained small, quiet, weathered by time, but the people who lived there carried the memory of the Bramwells with a kind of reverence now, a recognition that their story was part of the town's identity. Every October, on the anniversary of the disappearance, someone, usually Reverend Cole, or one of the older residents, would place fresh flowers at the memorial plaque and at the graves in the cemetery. And every year, without fail, a few visitors would arrive, true crime enthusiasts, historians, people who'd heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. They would stand at the plaque, read the inscription, and take a moment to reflect. Some left notes, others left small tokens: a stuffed animal for Amy, a toy car for Lucas, a candle for Thomas and Elaine. The town didn't mind, because the Bramwells were no longer just a mystery. They were part of the collective memory, a reminder of loss and resilience, of the importance of looking out for one another. On a foggy October evening in 2024, an elderly woman walked slowly up the path to the memorial plaque. Her name was Martha Kinsey, widow of the late Sheriff Harold Kinsey. She was in her 90s now, her steps careful, her hands gripping a cane for support. She carried a single white rose. When she reached the plaque, she stood for a long moment, reading the names etched into the metal. Thomas, Elaine, Lucas, Amy. She thought about the day her husband had found the empty house, the set table, the confusion and fear that had followed. She thought about the years of searching, the vigils, the prayers, the hope that had slowly faded. And she thought about the day the family had finally been found, not alive, but not forgotten. She placed the rose at the base of the plaque, her fingers trembling. "I'm sorry we couldn't find you sooner," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But you're home now. You're at peace." She stood there for a few more minutes, the mist curling around her, the forest silent and still. Then she turned and walked slowly back down the path, disappearing into the fog. The story of the Bramwell family became one of those tales that transcended its origin. It was retold in books, podcasts, documentaries, and classrooms. It was analyzed by criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists. It became a case study in the dangers of untreated mental illness, the importance of community awareness, and the need for better support systems in isolated areas. But beyond all the analysis, all the theories, all the lessons learned, the story remained fundamentally about four people: a father who worked hard to provide for his family, a mother who loved her community and her children, a son who was curious about the world around him, a daughter who saw beauty in simple things. They had been ordinary people, living ordinary lives, and then, in one terrible moment, they had been lost, not to violence, not to malice, but to the fractured mind of a man who believed he was saving them. In the years that followed, Laurel Ridge continued to change. New families moved in, drawn by affordable land and the quiet beauty of the mountain. The town remained small, but it persisted, adapting to the times, finding new ways to survive. The church still stood, the diner still served breakfast, and the people still gathered, still looked out for one another, still remembered, because that's what communities do. They endure, they remember, they carry the weight of their history and move forward, one step at a time. And in Laurel Ridge, the history included the Bramwells, a family who had vanished into the mist one October night and had never come home. A family who had been lost for 23 years before being found. A family who, in the end, had become a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. Years from now, long after the last person who knew the Bramwells has passed, the story will still be told. It will be whispered on foggy evenings, shared around campfires, recounted in books and documentaries yet to be made, and people will ask the same questions. How could this have happened? Could it have been prevented? What can we learn from it? But perhaps the most important question, the one that haunts every retelling, is this. How many other stories like this are still waiting to be discovered? How many other families have vanished into silence, their fates unknown, their voices unheard? How many other tragedies are buried in the earth, hidden in the dark, waiting for someone to find them? The memorial plaque still stands at the entrance to the sealed McCreary Tunnel. The forest has grown around it, reclaiming the land, but the plaque remains visible, its inscription clear, in memory of Thomas, Elaine, Lucas, and Amy Bramwell. Lost, October 1985. Found, September 2008. May they rest in peace, on certain October nights. When the mist rolls down from the ridge, and the hollow grows quiet, people still pause as they pass. They still think about the family that was lost. And they still wonder, not about lights on the ridge, not about ghosts or curses or mysteries unsolved, but about the fragility of life, the importance of connection, and the echoes of silence that remain long after the last voice has faded. In the end, the story of the Bramwell family is not about how they died. It's about how they lived, and how they are remembered. Sometimes, the silence speaks louder than any answer ever could.